The wind howls across the Yorkshire moors. Rain hammers against limestone that will never be finished. The year is 1893. Inside the skeleton of what was meant to be Britain's grandest palace, water pools on marble floors that cost more than most men earn in a lifetime. Scaffolding reaches toward a ceiling that will never hold chandeliers. The architect is dead. The money is gone. The workers have scattered. This was going to be Wentworth Woodhouse of the North, a palace to eclipse Blenheim, a statement carved in stone that would last forever. Instead, it stands abandoned on a hillside, windows gaping like empty eye sockets, a monument to ambition that ate itself alive. But this ruin is not alone. Across Britain, dozens of Gilded Age palaces you have never heard of rose and fell within a single generation. Built by industrial fortunes made from coal and steel and human sweat. Constructed by armies of workers whose names appear nowhere in the estate records. Designed to prove that new money could buy what old blood inherited. Most failed. Some burned. Others were demolished brick by brick when the bills came due. These are the lost palaces, the ones that did not make it into guidebooks, the ones whose stories reveal what the survivors carefully hide. This is the dark story of Britain's lost Gilded Age palaces you have never heard of. This is the story of ambition that reached too far, of men who built palaces to prove they belonged in a world that would never fully accept them, of workers who carved stone and laid floors and died in accidents that were never investigated, of beauty constructed on foundations that were always cracking. Between 1870 and 1914, Britain experienced a building frenzy unlike anything since the medieval cathedrals. Industrial fortunes poured into architecture. Coal barons, steel magnates, railway tycoons, men whose grandfathers had been nobodies suddenly commanded resources that rivaled dukes and earls. They wanted houses that announced their arrival, not comfortable homes, palaces, statements in limestone and marble that would force the old aristocracy to acknowledge that money, properly deployed, could buy anything, including history. Some succeeded: Castle Drogo, Cragside, Waddesdon Manor. These became the famous ones, the survivors that tourists visit today, their controversies smoothed into heritage narratives about innovation and taste. But for every palace that survived, 3 or 4 collapsed, ran out of money mid-construction, burned in suspicious fires, were torn down by heirs who could not afford the upkeep, were seized by creditors and auctioned off piece by piece, their carved staircases ending up in American hotels, their stained glass windows shipped to collectors who never knew where they came from. These lost palaces hold the real story, because when a building fails, the careful facade cracks. The account books get examined in bankruptcy court. The workers finally talk. The gap between the public story and the private reality becomes impossible to hide. What the guidebooks do not tell you is how many of these projects destroyed the families who commissioned them. How many workers were maimed or killed during construction? How the servants who kept the machinery running were paid wages that barely covered food and housing while sleeping in unheated attic rooms? How these palaces were often built on fortunes extracted from mines where children worked in darkness, from factories where safety was an afterthought, from land clearances that erased entire communities. This is not a story about architectural failure. It is a story about what happens when wealth concentrates in a few hands and those hands reach for immortality through stone and mortar, about the human cost of grandeur, about the servants and workers whose labor made beauty possible and whose names were never carved into the walls they built. We are going to visit 12 palaces you have never heard of. Some are ruins, some were demolished. Some stand converted into schools or hospitals or apartment blocks, their original purpose erased. Each one reveals something the famous survivors prefer to keep quiet. This is the complex, morally tangled story of Britain's lost Gilded Age palaces, the ones that teach harder lessons than the tourist attractions ever will. Alfred de Rothschild broke ground on Holton House in 1880 with a simple goal: build something so spectacular that even Queen Victoria would have to notice. The estate would have 200 rooms, a private circus arena, a winter garden under glass, and a ballroom copied from Versailles. Cost was irrelevant. Alfred had access to the Rothschild banking fortune and he intended to spend it. But what started as a 5-year project stretched to 15. Contractors quit. Architects were fired and replaced. The bills climbed past anything Alfred had imagined. By the time the house was finished in 1895, Alfred was exhausted, paranoid, and increasingly isolated. He would die in 1918, and within a generation, Holton House would be carved up and sold off piece by piece, its grand rooms turned into storage for the RAF during World War II. The palace that was meant to secure Alfred's legacy became the thing that consumed him. And beneath the tragedy of one man's obsession lay the wreckage of hundreds of workers' lives, spent building a dream they would never be allowed to enter. The site Alfred chose sat atop the Chiltern Hills, commanding views across Buckinghamshire, but requiring everything to be hauled upward. Stone from Portland quarries arrived by rail, then transferred to wagons that struggled up muddy roads. French craftsmen were imported to create the elaborate plasterwork and gilding Alfred demanded. Italian marble workers carved fireplaces that took 6 months each to complete. The winter garden alone required a steel and glass structure engineering feat that pushed Victorian technology to its limits and cost more than most country houses cost in their entirety. Alfred lived on site during construction, occupying a temporary residence and issuing daily instructions that contradicted previous orders. Walls were torn down and rebuilt. Entire rooms were redesigned midway through completion. The workforce swelled to over 400 men at peak periods. Accidents were frequent. Estate records mention injuries but rarely names. A stonemason fell from scaffolding in 1884 and died 3 days later. The coroner ruled it a misadventure. Work continued without pause. The servants' quarters, built in a separate wing, housed 60 staff in conditions that shocked even contemporary observers. Small rooms, inadequate heating, shared facilities. Yet these were the people who would make Alfred's palace function. Maids who cleaned 200 rooms, footmen who served elaborate dinners, engineers who maintained the complex heating and electrical systems Alfred had installed at enormous expense. When the house finally opened, Alfred hosted the Prince of Wales. The evening was judged a success. Photographs show Alfred looking thin and aged beyond his years. He was 47 but appeared 60. The palace had cost him over £1 million, equivalent to more than £100 million today, and it had cost him something else, less measurable. His health, his reputation among relatives who considered the project excessive even by Rothschild standards, and ultimately his peace of mind. He would spend the rest of his life maintaining something that would not survive him intact. The dream that was supposed to make him immortal instead marked the beginning of a slow decline that ended with the palace being requisitioned by the military and eventually demolished in parts, its grand staircase ending up in a hotel in London, its ballroom chandeliers scattered to private collectors who never knew their origin. William Beckford wanted a Gothic cathedral on his Wiltshire estate, but he wanted it now. Construction began in 1796. Beckford drove the workers relentlessly, offering bonuses for speed, hiring crews around the clock, pushing them through night shifts lit by torches. The tower rose 300 feet into the sky, the tallest structure in private hands in all of Britain. It was magnificent. It was also structurally unsound. The foundations were inadequate. The mortar was mixed too quickly. The timber scaffolding was removed before the stonework had properly set. In 1800, the tower collapsed. No one was killed by pure luck, but the message was clear. Beckford rebuilt it anyway. Same height, same design, same rush. It fell again in 1825, this time taking a section of the main house with it. Fonthill Abbey was abandoned, then demolished. What remains today is fragments scattered across the grounds, and a lesson about what happens when ambition refuses to wait for engineering to catch up. Beckford inherited a sugar plantation fortune built on Caribbean slave labor. By the 1790s, he possessed wealth estimated at £1 million and a reputation ruined by scandal, involving a young aristocrat. Fonthill became his refuge and his obsession. He hired architect James Wyatt to design a Gothic fantasy with a central tower that would be visible for miles. Wyatt warned that proper foundations would require years. Beckford gave him months. The workforce was driven to exhaustion. Beckford paid premium wages but demanded punishing hours. Men worked through winters that froze mortar before it could set. Safety protocols were ignored. When workers raised concerns about the tower's stability, Beckford dismissed them as cowardice. He wanted his cathedral, and he wanted it to dominate the landscape immediately. The first collapse came on a December night. The tower simply gave way, folding in on itself with a roar that was reportedly heard in the village 3 miles distant. Beckford was not in residence. He arrived the next morning and surveyed the wreckage with what witnesses described as eerie calm. Within a week, he had ordered reconstruction to begin. The second tower lasted longer, 25 years, but its fate was inevitable. The foundations remained inadequate. Cracks appeared in the walls within months of completion. By 1825, portions of the structure were visibly leaning. Beckford had sold Fonthill by then, financial pressures forcing him to retrench. The new owner was inspecting the property when the tower collapsed, nearly killing him and his surveyor. What remained of Fonthill Abbey was demolished in the 1840s. The stone was sold off and repurposed in local buildings. Today, only fragments survive. A gateway, portions of wall, the base of the tower foundation. Archaeologists who have studied the ruins confirm what Beckford's workers knew in 1796. The foundations were wholly inadequate for a structure of that height and weight. The mortar was poor quality, mixed hastily, and applied in cold conditions that prevented proper curing. Fonthill's failure was not architectural, it was moral. Beckford valued spectacle over substance, speed over safety, his vision over the reality his workers understood but were powerless to enforce. The tower that was meant to make him immortal instead became a cautionary tale repeated in architectural schools. Ambition without engineering is just expensive rubble, and the men who built it, who warned against it, who risked their lives climbing scaffolding they knew was inadequate, their names are lost entirely, remembered only as the anonymous workforce of a project that was doomed from the moment Beckford refused to wait. Thomas Wentworth made his money in coal. Deep Yorkshire mines where men worked in seemed so narrow they crawled on their bellies, where gas explosions were routine, where accidents were recorded in ledgers as operational losses, not human tragedies. By 1870, Wentworth had enough capital to build a palace that would rival Chatsworth. Wentworth Castle rose on a hilltop, 365 rooms, one for every day of the year, a deliberate boast. The construction employed 800 men at its peak, many of them pulled from the same mines that funded the project. They traded underground danger for above-ground exhaustion, hauling stone blocks that weighed hundreds of pounds up scaffolding that swayed in Yorkshire wind. Wentworth hosted lavish parties while his miners died at rates that shocked even Victorian inspectors. The palace still stands, converted now into apartments and a college campus, its ballrooms subdivided into functional modern spaces that bear no trace of the coal dust and blood that paid for every chandelier. The mines that built Wentworth Castle were hellish even by the standards of an era that accepted industrial death as routine. Seams averaged 3 feet in height, forcing men to work on their knees or stomachs. Ventilation was minimal. Methane accumulated in pockets and ignited with terrible regularity. Between 1860 and 1880, Wentworth's mines reported 147 fatalities in company records. The actual number was likely higher, as non-fatal injuries and deaths from lung disease were not systematically documented. Wentworth paid slightly above average wages, a fact he highlighted when defending his labor practices. What he did not mention was that his mines operated 6 days a week, 12-hour shifts, in conditions that destroyed men's lungs within a decade. Workers who complained about safety were marked as troublemakers and found themselves without employment not just at Wentworth's operations, but at any pit for miles, as owners maintained informal blacklists. The palace itself rose between 1870 and 1878. Wentworth commissioned architects William Lindley and William Henry Crossland, instructing them to create something that would dwarf the neighboring estates of older families. The building incorporated every modern system: central heating via massive basement boilers, gas lighting throughout, indoor plumbing with hot water, an innovation still rare in even aristocratic homes. The construction workforce overlapped significantly with the mining workforce. Records show that during winter months when mine output decreased, Wentworth transferred workers to construction projects, maintaining their employment but shifting the nature of their labor. They hauled Yorkshire stone from local quarries, carved it under the direction of imported master masons, and hoisted it into place using wooden cranes and sheer physical strength. 3 workers died during construction. One fell from the roof while laying slate. Another was crushed when a stone block slipped from its chains. The third succumbed to an infection after a scaffold collapse broke his leg. The families received no compensation. Wentworth attended none of the funerals. When the palace opened in 1879, Wentworth hosted a ball for 400 guests. Champagne flowed. An orchestra played in the ballroom. The Prince of Wales sent his regrets, but a gift arrived: a silver centerpiece that was displayed prominently. Newspapers covered the event extensively, praising Wentworth's taste and generosity. 3 months later, an explosion in one of his mines killed 23 men and boys. The youngest victim was 12 years old. The inquest ruled it an accident caused by a worker's carelessness. No systemic safety failures were identified. The mine reopened within a week. Wentworth did not attend the inquest. He was at Wentworth Castle, hosting a hunting party, entertaining the same social circle that had celebrated his architectural achievement while remaining carefully incurious about the industrial system that funded their champagne and venison. Whitley Court burned in 1937. The fire started in the early morning hours, cause unknown, though rumors of insurance fraud spread immediately. By the time firefighters arrived, the blaze was unstoppable. The roof collapsed. The interior was gutted. What had been one of Britain's grandest Victorian palaces became a blackened shell within hours. The ruins stood abandoned for decades, slowly decaying until English heritage finally stabilized them as a picturesque ruin in the 1970s. But the fire did something the original builders never intended. It exposed the structure beneath the beauty. The cheap brickwork hidden behind limestone facades, the inadequate firewalls. The servants' quarters were built with materials that would never have been acceptable in the family wings. The fire revealed what prosperity always hides: that grandeur is often a thin surface stretched over compromises, shortcuts, and the systematic exploitation of people who had no choice but to accept whatever conditions were offered. Whitley Court's history stretched back to the Jacobean era, but the Victorian transformation began in 1837 when it was purchased by William Ward, 1st Earl of Dudley, whose fortune came from mining and metalworks in the Black Country. Ward spent £100,000 on renovations, a sum that would exceed £10 million today. He hired architect Samuel Dawkes to create an Italianate palazzo with a portico copied from a Roman temple. The construction work revealed the Victorian building industry's standard practices. Master craftsmen commanded high wages and were treated with respect. They created the visible elements: carved stone, ornamental plasterwork, decorative metalwork. Below them was a larger workforce of laborers who handled the heavy, dangerous work for a fraction of the pay. These men dug foundations, mixed mortar, hauled materials, and worked in conditions that prioritized speed and cost control over safety. The servants' quarters at Whitley were typical of their era, which is to say, barely adequate. Small rooms in the attic and basement, minimal heating, shared facilities. The top floor, where housemaids slept, was accessible only by narrow staircases. When the fire broke out in 1937, those staircases became death traps. The building was unoccupied at the time, the family having abandoned it years earlier due to mounting costs. But had staff still lived there, casualties would have been inevitable. The fire investigation, such as it was, concluded that the blaze started in the southeast corner, possibly from an electrical fault. though the building had been without power for years. Insurance paid out, but not the full value. The shell was too expensive to restore. The family sold the estate. The house stood empty, windows broken by vandals, lead stripped from the roof by thieves, gardens returning to wilderness. When English Heritage took over in 1972, they stabilized the ruins rather than attempting reconstruction. What emerged was architecturally instructive. The limestone facade that had looked so substantial was revealed as cladding over common brick. Interior walls that appeared to be solid stone were actually plaster over wood framing. The grand staircases were built from pine rather than hardwood, painted and grained to look expensive. None of this was dishonest by Victorian standards. It was simply practical building technique, using expensive materials only where they would be visible. But it gave the lie to the idea that these palaces were built to last centuries. They were built to impress for a generation or two, constructed with an assumption of continuous maintenance and eventual replacement of systems and surfaces. The workers who built Whitley understood this, though they left no written record. The structures they raised were beautiful, but fundamentally compromised, designed to look permanent while incorporating shortcuts that saved money and time. The fire simply accelerated a decay that was always inevitable, revealing the truth beneath the performance of solidity and permanence. The 5th Duke of Portland inherited Welbeck Abbey in 1854 and immediately began digging, not expansions or gardens, but tunnels. Miles of underground passages connecting rooms that were never meant to be seen. A ballroom 160 feet long buried beneath the lawn. A library, a billiard room, entire suites of apartments, all underground, all lit by gaslight that barely held back the darkness. The Duke rarely left Welbeck. He communicated with servants through notes passed under doors. He had chicken delivered to his rooms on a miniature railway. The construction work continued for decades, employing hundreds of laborers who worked in shifts, excavating clay and limestone, shoring up tunnels with brick vaults, never entirely sure what they were building or why. The Duke died in 1879. His successors filled in many of the tunnels, but portions remain, eerie and cold, a physical manifestation of isolation, paranoia, and the kind of wealth that allows a man to reshape the earth itself according to his private obsessions, while the world above continues unaware. The Duke's motivation has been debated by historians. Some suggest disfigurement from illness made him avoid being seen. Others point to social anxiety or mental illness. Whatever the cause, his solution was to create an environment where he could live entirely apart from human contact, while still maintaining the infrastructure of a ducal household. The excavation work began in earnest in 1860. The Duke hired engineer Thomas Walker, who had experience with railway tunnels. The project was presented to workers as improvements to the estate: expanded cellars, service corridors, storage facilities. Only gradually did it become clear that the Duke was building something stranger and more extensive. The tunnels were built properly, whatever their purpose. Brick-lined, properly drained, with ventilation shafts that reached the surface at carefully hidden points. The underground ballroom was extraordinary, its ceiling vaulted and painted pink, its walls lined with mirrors and lit by thousands of gas jets. The floor was laid with perfectly sprung pine boards. The room was designed to host hundreds of guests, but it never did. The Duke never used it for its intended purpose. It sat empty, gleaming and perfect and utterly pointless. The workforce understood they were building something unusual. They were paid well, above standard wages for excavation work, with the implicit understanding that silence was part of the compensation. The Duke did not want his projects discussed in local pubs or analyzed in newspapers. His money bought both labor and discretion. The living conditions for workers were Spartan but adequate. Temporary housing was erected on the grounds. Food was provided. Medical care was available, necessary given the dangers of underground work. Cave-ins were a constant risk. Several occurred, though the estate records are vague about casualties. Local parish records mention burials of men identified as laborers at Welbeck, but causes of death are rarely specified. By the 1870s, the tunnel network extended for miles. It connected the house to the stables, the kitchen wing to the main building, the riding school to the ballroom. Much of it was simply passageway, wide enough for two men to pass but not much more, lit by gas lamps spaced every 20 feet. Walking through them, as the Duke apparently did regularly, must have been like moving through a brick-lined warren, the air cool and slightly damp, the sound of footsteps echoing off walls. When the Duke died in 1879, his relatives were shocked by what they inherited. The above-ground portions of Welbeck were relatively modest. The underground complex was vast, expensive to maintain, and functionally useless for normal estate operations. Much of it was sealed and filled in, though portions remain accessible today, opened occasionally for tours that market the Duke's eccentricity as charming rather than tragic, a marketing choice that overlooks the profound loneliness and waste the tunnels actually represent. Hugh Hughes made millions in copper smelting and Welsh slate quarries. By 1870, he had decided to build a palace that would dominate North Wales, a statement that an industrial fortune could command the same respect as any landed estate. Kinmel Hall was designed in French chateau style, a deliberate nod to European aristocracy. The project cost more than Hughes had projected, much more. Construction dragged on for years. Labor disputes erupted. Workers walked off the site demanding better pay and safer conditions, radical acts for the 1870s that were crushed by local authorities. Hughes poured more money into the project, then more, draining his liquid capital to keep the palace rising. By the time it was finished in 1874, Hughes was overextended. The copper market turned. The slate industry faced new competition. Hughes died in 1882, effectively bankrupt. Kinmel Hall passed through a series of owners, none able to afford its upkeep, until it finally burned in 1975. The ruins sat abandoned for years, a charred testament to the risk of building monuments when your fortune depends on commodity prices and global markets that care nothing for your architectural ambitions. Kinmel Hall required 700 workers at peak construction. Hughes hired Welsh labourers from his own quarries and smelters, reasoning that he could control costs by keeping employment internal. The wages he offered were standard for industrial work, but inadequate for the specialised skills construction demanded. Tensions built quickly. In 1872, a group of stone carvers stopped work, demanding a pay increase. Hughes refused. The carvers held firm. Within a week, other trades joined them. Carpenters, plasterers, labourers. It was not quite a strike. Strikes were illegal under the Master and Servant Act, but it was close. Hughes brought in magistrates. The ringleaders were arrested and charged with breach of contract. 2 were sentenced to prison. The rest returned to work under threat of similar prosecution. The incident was covered in local newspapers but framed as troublemakers attempting to extort an honest employer. Hughes gave interviews portraying himself as a victim of worker ingratitude. What the coverage ignored was the context. Workers were being asked to perform skilled labor at unskilled rates. They were housed in barracks with minimal sanitation. Injuries were common and compensation non-existent. The house itself was spectacular when completed. 160 rooms, a grand staircase copied from a Loire Valley chateau, interiors panelled in oak carved by craftsman Hughes imported from France. The ballroom could accommodate 200 guests. The grounds included formal gardens, a lake, a private chapel. Hughes hosted the Prince of Wales in 1875, an event he viewed as confirmation of his arrival in British society. But the cost had been enormous. Hughes had projected £200,000. The final bill approached £400,000. He had borrowed heavily to complete the project, confident that his industrial operations would generate sufficient income to service the debt. They did not. Copper prices fell in the late 1870s as American mines flooded the market. The Welsh slate industry, which Hughes had helped build, faced competition from cheaper Cornish slate and imported alternatives. By 1880, Hughes was struggling. He mortgaged Kinmel to cover business losses. He cut his household staff from 60 to 30. He sold art and furniture. It was not enough. When he died in 1882, creditors moved immediately. Kinmel was auctioned along with its contents. The purchaser was a ship owner who held it for 15 years before selling again. The pattern repeated through the 20th century. Owners were financially overwhelmed by the estate's demands, and left. The army used it during World War I. It became a hotel in the 1920s. It was nearly demolished in the 1960s. The fire in 1975 settled the question. The interior was destroyed. The shell stood for decades, slowly collapsing, until developers finally purchased it in the 2000s and converted what remained into luxury apartments. A final transformation that erased nearly all trace of Hughes's original vision and the labor that built it. Mentmore Towers was a Rothschild palace, built in the 1850s by Baron Meyer de Rothschild, with the same obsessive attention to detail that marked all Rothschild construction projects. But in 1878, a servant named Sarah Collins was dismissed under mysterious circumstances. She took with her copies of household account books, documents that should never have left the estate. What those ledgers revealed, when they surfaced years later in a bankruptcy case involving one of Sarah's relatives, was the true cost of running a palace. The wages paid to servants were far lower than the family publicly claimed. The conditions in the servants' quarters violated local housing ordinances. The estate had systematically underreported its workforce to avoid taxes. None of this was unique to Mentmore. What was unique was that it got documented and entered into public record. The scandal was buried quickly, the documents sealed, Sarah paid off and silenced. But the truth had escaped, if only briefly. Behind every perfect surface, every flawless dinner party, every gilded room, was a machinery of exploitation that only functioned because the people who kept it running had no power to refuse. Sarah Collins had been employed at Mentmore for 12 years, rising from scullery maid to under housekeeper. She was literate, unusual for servants of her background, and had been given responsibility for maintaining portions of the household accounts. This gave her access to information that normally stayed locked in the estate office. The documents she copied showed systematic discrepancies. The Rothschilds publicly stated they employed 45 staff at Mentmore and paid them above average wages. The internal ledgers told a different story. At any given time, between 60 and 70 people worked at the estate. The additional workers were categorized as temporary or casual labor, a classification that allowed the estate to avoid certain legal obligations regarding housing and working conditions. Many were women and children employed in the laundries and kitchens for wages that fell below even the minimal standards of the era. The servants' quarters at Mentmore occupied the top floor and basement. The upper rooms, where housemaids and junior staff slept, were cramped and inadequately heated. During winter, ice formed on the inside of windows. The basement rooms, housing kitchen and laundry workers, were damp and poorly ventilated. Local health ordinances required a minimum of 400 cubic feet of airspace per person in sleeping quarters. Many rooms at Mentmore fell well short, housing 3 or 4 people in spaces designed for 2. Sarah's dismissal came after she raised concerns about conditions with the housekeeper. The exact nature of the confrontation is unclear from surviving records, but Sarah was terminated without a character reference, a devastating blow that made future domestic employment nearly impossible. She took her revenge by taking the ledgers. The documents remained hidden for years. Sarah moved to London, married, and worked in a shop. When her husband's business failed in 1889, creditors began examining all family assets. Sarah's copied ledgers surfaced during bankruptcy proceedings. A lawyer noticed discrepancies and brought them to the attention of local authorities. The scandal was contained swiftly. Rothschild lawyers appeared immediately. The judge sealed the documents, ruling them irrelevant to the bankruptcy case. Sarah received a cash payment, variously reported as between £200 and £500, in exchange for her silence and the return of all copies. The case disappeared from public view, but details leaked. Journalists heard rumours. Questions were asked in Parliament about conditions at large estates and whether existing labour laws were being enforced. The Rothschilds were never named publicly, but privately they understood they had been exposed. Conditions at Mentmore quietly improved. Wages increased. Staffing levels were adjusted to match legal requirements. Sarah Collins died in 1912. Her obituary made no mention of her employment at Mentmore or the documents she had preserved. But the ledgers, or copies of them, survived in legal archives, accessible to historians who knew where to look and what they proved. That even the most respectable families operated systems of exploitation that depended on workers having no voice and no recourse. William Waldorf Astor purchased Cliveden in 1893 for £250,000, a staggering sum that announced his intentions. He was American new money, determined to force his way into British high society through sheer financial power. Cliveden had history. It had been a duchess's residence, but it had also burned twice and been rebuilt each time. Astor hired architects and craftsmen and spent another fortune on renovations that transformed the estate into something that looked ancient, but was in fact brand new, a stage set for aristocratic legitimacy. The strategy worked, partially. Astor's descendants married into British nobility. Cliveden became famous for hosting politicians and power brokers, especially in the 1930s when the Cliveden set met there to discuss appeasement with Nazi Germany. But the house never fully escaped its origins. It was always, at its core, a purchased title, a bought history, a place where new money performed old traditions with slightly too much polish, slightly too much effort. The performance was convincing enough to grant access, but never quite convincing enough to erase the transaction at its foundation. Astor's purchase of Cliveden was strategic. He had moved to Britain in 1890 following a bitter family dispute over the Astor fortune in New York. In Britain, he saw an opportunity to reinvent himself not as merely wealthy, but as aristocratic. British society was more rigid than American, but it was also more financially desperate. The agricultural depression of the 1880s had devastated many landed estates. Titles and historic houses were available to anyone willing to pay the maintenance costs. Cliveden required extensive work. The house had been rebuilt in the 1850s after a fire destroyed the previous structure. Astor modernized everything: electricity, central heating, expanded servants' quarters, new stables, redesigned gardens. He hired 300 workers and spent 3 years on renovations that cost an additional £100,000. The workforce included local labourers and specialised craftsmen imported from London and the continent. Astor paid well but demanded perfection. Work that did not meet his standards was torn out and redone at the contractor's expense. The pressure drove some firms to bankruptcy. Astor's relationship with his staff was formal and distant. He employed over 50 servants at Cliveden, maintaining a hierarchy that was traditional in structure but American in its emphasis on efficiency. Servants were expected to be invisible, present only when summoned, and their quarters reflected this philosophy: functional but Spartan, designed to make clear that this was a workplace, not a home. The social project took longer than the physical renovation. Astor became a British citizen in 1899. He cultivated relationships with politicians and titled families. He donated generously to conservative causes. He purchased newspapers, including The Observer, using them to promote his vision of Anglo-American cooperation and to attack anyone he considered a rival or obstacle. His son Waldorf married Nancy Shaw in 1906, a union that brought American money and British connections together. Nancy became the real social force at Cliveden. She hosted weekend parties that mixed politicians, artists, writers, and aristocrats in combinations that were unusual for Edwardian Britain. The gatherings were famous for their intellectual conversation and political influence. By the 1930s, Cliveden had become shorthand for a particular kind of power: unelected, informal, exercised through social relationships rather than official positions. The Cliveden set, as journalists called it, met regularly to discuss British policy. Their support for appeasement with Nazi Germany became controversial, especially after war broke out. Nancy defended their position as pragmatic rather than sympathetic to fascism, but the damage to Cliveden's reputation was lasting. The Astors never fully escaped the perception that they had purchased their position rather than inherited it. Their money opened doors but could not erase the transaction. British aristocrats accepted their hospitality, attended their parties, married their children, and still maintained a subtle distance, a reminder that new money, however large, was not the same as old blood. Cliveden remained a stage set, convincing from a distance, but revealing its constructed nature upon close inspection, a palace where the performance was flawless, but the audience always knew they were watching a show. Not every Gilded Age palace was a new construction. Some were medieval structures renovated and expanded by industrial fortunes looking for instant aristocratic pedigree. Lancaster Castle fell into this category. Purchased by a textile magnate in 1875, it underwent massive renovations meant to turn a drafty medieval pile into a comfortable modern residence wrapped in historical costume. The work required hundreds of laborers, many of them Irish immigrants desperate for any employment. Conditions were brutal. The castle's remote location meant workers effectively lived on site, housed in temporary barracks with minimal sanitation. Wages were paid irregularly. Those who complained were dismissed immediately and escorted off the property by private security. 2 workers died during construction, one from a fall, one from an infection that went untreated. Neither death triggered an investigation. Their families received no compensation. The castle opened to great fanfare in 1880. The workers who built it disappeared back into the industrial workforce, their names recorded nowhere except in parish burial records that listed their occupations simply as laborer. The textile magnate was James Morrison, whose mills produced cotton cloth for global markets. By the 1870s, he controlled factories across Lancashire and had accumulated enough capital to indulge his obsession with medieval architecture. Lancaster Castle appealed to him precisely because it was ancient, its origins traceable to the Norman conquest. Owning it would grant instant historical legitimacy. The renovation work began in 1875 and immediately encountered problems. Medieval castles were not designed for comfort. Walls were thick but poorly insulated. Windows were small and allowed drafts. The internal layout was a maze of stairs and passages that made modern domestic service nearly impossible. Morrison's solution was to gut the interior while preserving the exterior, creating a modern house hidden inside medieval walls. The workforce peaked at 350 men. Most were housed in wooden barracks erected in the castle grounds. The structures were minimally adequate. Bunks, a communal kitchen, outdoor latrines, no heating, no privacy. Workers paid for their own food, purchased from a company store that charged inflated prices, a common practice that trapped workers in debt to their employer. Irish labourers formed the majority of the workforce. They had fled famine and poverty in Ireland, seeking any employment. Morrison's agents recruited them directly from Liverpool docks, offering steady work and the promise of fair treatment. The reality was different. Hours were long, typically 12 per day, 6 days a week. Safety equipment was non-existent. Falls from scaffolding and walls were frequent. The first death occurred in 1876. A labourer named Patrick O'Connor fell from the castle's north wall, a drop of approximately 40 feet onto stone paving. He died instantly. The castle management recorded the incident in a ledger, but did not notify authorities. O'Connor's body was buried in the local parish cemetery. His family in Ireland was never informed. The second death came in 1878. Michael Brennan cut his hand on stone and developed an infection. The castle's medical care consisted of a single doctor who visited once a week. By the time Brennan was seen, the infection had spread too far. He died 3 days later. Again, no investigation. Again, no compensation. Workers who protested conditions were immediately terminated. Morrison maintained a blacklist shared with other industrial employers in the region. Workers dismissed from Lancaster Castle found themselves unemployable across Lancashire, a punishment that extended beyond the individual to their families, as unemployment meant destitution. The castle opened in 1880 with a banquet for 200 guests. Morrison gave a speech celebrating the restoration of an ancient seat of English power. Newspapers praised his historical sensitivity and his contribution to preserving national heritage. None mentioned the workers who had made it possible or the conditions under which they had labored. Lancaster Castle remained in the Morrison family until 1920, when it was sold to pay death duties. It passed through several owners before being converted to institutional use. Today it serves as a conference centre and tourist attraction. The barracks where workers lived are gone. The records of their employment were lost or deliberately destroyed. Only the parish burial records remain, cryptic entries that name men who died as labourers at the castle, their full stories erased by time and deliberate forgetting. Charles Thelewson made his fortune in railways. By the 1860s, he controlled lines across northern England, moving coal, steel, passengers, and goods through a network that seemed to print money. He commissioned Brodsworth Hall as his monument, an Italianate palace that would prove industrial wealth could match aristocratic elegance. The house was completed in 1863, perfect timing to catch the peak of railway dominance. But within a generation, the industry began to consolidate. Smaller lines like Thelewson's were bought out or squeezed by larger competitors. His fortune shrank. By the time he died in 1885, the estate was heavily mortgaged. His heirs held on, but barely, cutting staff, closing wings, selling art and furniture piece by piece to cover debts. Brodsworth survived, technically, but as a shadow of its intended self, a palace without the income stream necessary to maintain its grandeur. It limped into the 20th century and was finally saved in the 1990s when English heritage took it over, preserving it not as a triumph, but as evidence of what happens when a fortune built on a single industry meets technological change and market forces that respect no amount of limestone and gilt. Thelewson inherited railway investments from his father, but expanded them aggressively in the 1850s. His strategy was to build or acquire smaller regional lines that connected industrial areas to major ports and cities. The timing was perfect. Britain's railway boom was at its height. Capital flowed freely. Investors treated railway shares like guaranteed income. Brodsworth Hall was designed by architect Philip Wilkinson in the Italianate style fashionable among wealthy industrialists of the period. The house had 40 rooms, elaborately decorated interiors, and modern systems including central heating and gas lighting. The estate included 3,000 acres of parkland, formal gardens, and all the infrastructure expected of a country seat: stables, greenhouses, service buildings. Construction took 3 years and employed 200 workers at peak. Thelewson was personally involved, visiting the site regularly and making changes to the plans that delayed completion and increased costs. The final bill approached £100,000, a sum Thelewson could afford in 1863, but which represented a larger portion of his capital than prudent financial management would recommend. The house functioned properly for about 15 years. Thelewson employed 30 servants and entertained regularly. But beneath the surface, his fortune was eroding. Railway consolidation began in the 1870s as larger companies absorbed smaller competitors. Thelewson's lines were marginal, profitable, but not essential to the emerging national network. He resisted buyout offers, believing his independence was valuable. It was not. By 1880, several of his lines were losing money. Maintenance costs were rising. Competition from other routes was cutting into passenger and freight revenue. Thelewson began borrowing against Brodsworth to cover railway losses, a financial strategy that made sense only if railway income recovered. It did not. When Thelewson died in 1885, his estate was insolvent. The railway lines were sold, mostly at a loss, to larger companies that merged them into bigger networks. Brodsworth was mortgaged to multiple creditors. His heirs faced a choice: sell the house and clear the debts, or hold on and hope that time would improve their position. They chose to hold on, a decision that condemned them to decades of genteel decline. The staff was cut to 15, then to 10. The wings of the house were closed. Furniture and art were sold at auction. The proceeds used to pay interest on mortgages. The family lived in increasingly reduced circumstances, maintaining appearances while privately struggling to pay basic bills. By the 1920s, Brodsworth was effectively derelict. The family still occupied a few rooms, but most of the house was unused, unheated and slowly deteriorating. Roofs leaked, damp spread through walls. Elaborate plasterwork cracked and fell. The gardens returned to wilderness. The house survived into the 1990s only through stubborn family determination and good luck. When the last heir died, English Heritage acquired it and made a controversial decision. Rather than restore Brodsworth to its 1863 glory, they would preserve it as it was found, a record of decline and decay. The peeling wallpaper stayed. The empty rooms remained empty. The house became a monument not to wealth and success but to the fragility of fortune, the inevitable decay that follows when income stops but buildings remain, demanding care that no one can afford to provide. When William Gibbs died in 1875, he left Tintersfield to his sons, along with a fortune made from importing guano fertilizer from South America. The sons expanded the estate, adding wings and modern systems, confident the money would last forever. It did not. By the 1920s, the guano trade had collapsed, replaced by synthetic fertilizers. The family fortune evaporated. Tintersfield became a burden. The sons wanted to sell, to tear it down if necessary, to escape the crushing cost of maintaining a palace they could no longer afford. But William's widow, Matilda, refused. She took control of the estate and fought a decades-long battle to preserve it, cutting costs ruthlessly, dismissing staff, closing rooms, but holding the core structure intact. She succeeded, barely, dying in 1887, with Tintersfield still standing but financially exhausted. Her defiance ensured the house survived long enough for the National Trust to acquire it in 2002. The story became one of preservation and determination. What it also was, though less celebrated, was evidence that survival often required someone willing to sacrifice everything, including comfort and dignity, to hold on to a building that represented more than just architecture. It represented identity, legacy, and the stubborn refusal to let industrial fortune disappear without a trace. William Gibbs had made his fortune through the most unlikely commodity, bird droppings. Guano, accumulated over centuries on islands off the coast of Peru and Chile, was extraordinarily rich in nitrogen and phosphorus, making it the perfect fertilizer for Britain's agricultural revolution. Gibbs established a virtual monopoly on its import, shipping thousands of tons annually and charging premium prices. The fortune he amassed was staggering. By 1870, Gibbs was one of Britain's richest men. He purchased Tintersfield, a modest Georgian house, in 1843 and spent the next 3 decades transforming it into a Gothic revival palace. The house eventually had 90 rooms, a private chapel, elaborate gardens, and all the technological innovations of the era. When William died in 1875, his sons Anthony and George inherited equal shares. They continued expanding the estate, confident that guano profits would sustain them indefinitely. But the trade was already under threat. Chemical companies were developing synthetic fertilizers that could be produced cheaply and consistently. Guano, dependent on distant islands and unpredictable bird populations, could not compete. By the early 1900s, the family's income had collapsed. The sons faced enormous maintenance costs with shrinking resources. They proposed selling Tintersfield and dividing the proceeds. Matilda, William's widow, opposed them fiercely. Tintersfield was not just a house. It was William's monument, the physical embodiment of his achievement and the family's identity. Matilda was in her 70s, but she took control. She dismissed half the servants, reducing the household from 40 staff to 20. She closed the East Wing entirely. She sold furniture, paintings, and decorative objects that were not essential. She negotiated with creditors, paying interest on mortgages but never reducing the principal. She cut every possible expense while maintaining just enough activity to keep the core structure from decay. The servants who remained worked under increasingly difficult conditions. Wages were reduced, hours increased. Matilda managed the household with ruthless efficiency, demanding absolute loyalty and accepting no complaints. Those who objected were dismissed immediately. The family that had once hosted lavish parties now lived in near isolation. Guests were rare. Social activities ceased. The house that William built to display his success became a fortress Matilda defended against creditors and her own sons, who she viewed as cowards willing to abandon their father's legacy. She succeeded, barely. When she died in 1887, Tintisfield remained intact, though heavily mortgaged and minimally staffed. Her sons inherited a house they still could not afford, but selling it now felt like betraying their mother's sacrifice. They held on, barely, through the early 20th century. The family struggled through 2 world wars and the Great Depression. By the 1970s, Tintisfield was visibly decaying. Roofs leaked, paint peeled, systems failed. But the family refused to sell, trapped by Matilda's example and their own sense that abandoning Tintisfield would mean admitting defeat. When the last family member died in 2001, the National Trust purchased Tintisfield for £82 million raised through public appeal. The house was preserved, not restored but stabilized, its peeling wallpaper and worn carpets left visible as evidence of its struggle to survive. Matilda's story is often told as heroic preservation, but it was also brutal. She sacrificed comfort, relationships, and eventually her health to hold on to a building. The servants she dismissed faced unemployment and destitution. Her sons lived under her judgment and control. Tintisfield survived, but at a human cost that the preservation narrative rarely acknowledges. Across Britain, the ruins and survivors of the Gilded Age palace-building frenzy stand as evidence. Some are preserved as heritage sites, some converted into schools, hospitals, apartment blocks, some abandoned entirely, their windows broken, their roofs collapsed, their gardens returned to wilderness. Each one teaches a lesson about ambition, about the cost of grandeur, about the people who built beauty they would never own and maintained systems they could never escape. The industrial fortunes that funded these palaces came from coal mines and steel mills, from railways and textiles, from global trade networks that extracted resources from colonized lands and labor from workers who had no choice but to accept whatever wages were offered. The palaces themselves were built by stonemasons and carpenters, by servants and groundskeepers whose names appeared in ledgers as line items, not as human beings. These buildings embodied the Gilded Age's central contradiction: spectacular beauty constructed on systematic exploitation, monuments to permanence built by people who would never experience security, dreams of immortality funded by industries that consumed human lives as routine operational costs. The question these ruins force us to confront is simple and uncomfortable. Was it worth it? The arithmetic is brutal when examined honestly. Halton House cost over £1 million and employed 400 workers over 15 years. It functioned as Alfred de Rothschild's residence for 23 years before being carved up and demolished. The building lasted 1 generation. The workers who built it received wages that, even accounting for inflation, left most of them in poverty. Their children inherited no wealth, no property, no security. Alfred inherited millions and died anxious and isolated despite building a palace meant to secure his happiness. Fonthill Abbey collapsed twice, killing no one only by luck. William Beckford spent £273,000, the equivalent of tens of millions today, on a structure that could not stand because he refused to wait for proper foundations. The workers who warned him were ignored. Their expertise was overruled by his impatience. When the tower fell, Beckford lost money. The workers lost nothing because they had nothing to lose, but they were proven right in the most visceral way possible. Wentworth Castle stands, but the coal mines that funded it killed 147 men in documented accidents and uncounted more from lung disease. Thomas Wentworth's 365 rooms required the systematic destruction of human lungs and the acceptance that worker death was simply the cost of extracting coal. The beauty of the palace cannot be separated from the ugliness of how it was funded. These are not unique stories. They are the pattern. Every palace required a fortune. Every fortune came from somewhere. Coal mines, textile mills, railway monopolies, colonial trade, chemical works, arms manufacturing. Some industries were more directly violent than others, but all depended on extracting maximum value from labor while returning minimum wages. The workers who built these palaces were not slaves, but their choices were constrained by economic systems that concentrated wealth and power in a few hands. Work for poverty wages or starve. Live in inadequate housing or sleep rough. Accept dangerous conditions or be replaced by someone more desperate. This was not freedom. It was coercion dressed in the language of free markets and voluntary contracts. The palaces also embodied enormous waste. Resources poured into structures that served tiny populations, while the majority lived in overcrowded slums. Materials shipped across oceans for decorative purposes, while local populations lacked basic infrastructure. Skilled labor diverted from productive purposes to create beauty that was locked behind gates and accessible only to those who could afford the entry price of wealth or aristocratic birth. Yet dismissing these buildings entirely feels wrong. They represent extraordinary human achievement. The craftsmanship was real. The engineering was innovative. The architecture pushed boundaries and created beauty that millions now appreciate through heritage tourism. Destroying them in retrospect would not return the coal miners to life or put money in the pockets of long-dead servants. The honest answer is that these palaces are both impressive and damning. They prove that humans can create spectacular beauty and that they often do so through systems of exploitation. Both truths exist simultaneously. Pretending otherwise, celebrating the palaces without acknowledging their cost or condemning them without recognizing their achievement is dishonest. What these ruins teach is that beauty is not innocent, that grandeur has a price, that the people who pay are rarely the people who benefit. That industrial capitalism concentrated wealth in ways that enabled architectural marvels and immense human suffering at the same time. That we inherit not just buildings but moral questions about what we value, whose labor we acknowledge, and what kind of society we want to build going forward. The palaces stand or crumble. The dead remain dead. But the questions persist, waiting for answers we still have not provided.